In 1987, the Universal House of Justice wrote to the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of the United States, asking them to give the most careful consideration to reviving Race Amity Conferences as a regular feature among the activities of the National Baha'i community.
Friends, the story we're about to share with you is a true story. It's based on American history and Baha'i history. It's a story of the marvelous vision that Abdu'l-Baha had for the possibility of racial unity and fellowship in America during the early decades of the 20th century. He moved the Baha'i faith into the public arena when he asked us to do Race Amity Conferences as a public service for the greater good of our country. It's also a story of personal transformation of the two remarkable individuals that Abdu'l-Baha chose to promote race amity work in America. The first individual was Louis Gregory, a black attorney who during his formative years grew up right here in the historic city of Charleston, South Carolina. He was deeply versed in racial issues as a person of color and of African descent growing up in America. The second person that Abdu'l-Baha chose to further the work of race amity in America was Mrs. Agnes Parsons, a wealthy white woman from Washington, D.C., who, relatively speaking, knew very little of racial issues. Each of these dedicated souls made historic contributions to further race amity work in America. I was moved, I was touched, as I took a closer look at their stories, and we're delighted to share their stories with you at this time, friends.
In 1921, Abdu'l-Baha, who was the son of the Prophet Baha'u'llah and the perfect example of what it means to be a Baha'i, launched a public Baha'i initiative on race that was unparalleled in the history of our nation. He inaugurated a series of Race Amity Conventions in America for the sole purpose of focusing the nation's attention on the need for racial unity at a time when race relations were rapidly deteriorating. Abdu'l-Baha had personally witnessed increasing racial tensions during his visit to the United States. He knew immediate and sustained action was necessary and predicted escalating racial violence. The three main characters in this story are Abdu'l-Baha, the center of the covenant of Baha'u'llah, Louis Gregory, the standard-bearer for racial unity, and Agnes Parsons, the founder of Race Amity Conventions in America. The Emancipation Proclamation was issued by President Abraham Lincoln in 1863. It freed slaves in those states resisting Union forces. At the same time, on the other side of the globe, Baha'u'llah, prophet of the Baha'i faith, announced his mission in Baghdad. As the latest messenger of God, his teachings would usher in an era of peace and divine justice. The best beloved of all things in my sight is justice. Know ye not why we created you all from the same dust? That no one should exalt himself over the other. Later he revealed, the purpose of justice is the appearance of unity among men. Exiled and imprisoned for nearly 50 years, Baha'u'llah revealed numerous tablets to the kings and rulers of the earth, exhorting them to deal with their subjects with undeviating justice. As freed slaves began to rebuild their lives in the United States, Baha'u'llah revealed his most holy book, the Kitab-i-Aqdas, in which he addressed the leaders of the Western Hemisphere. Ulysses S. Grant was the President of the United States. Hearken ye, O rulers of America, and presidents of the republics therein. Adorn ye the temple of dominion with the ornament of justice and of the fear of God. Bind ye the broken with the hands of justice, and crush the oppressor who flourisheth with the rod of the commandments of your Lord, the ordainer, the all-wise. Americans of African descent were migrating to places where they could start new lives and search for loved ones sold on auction blocks during slavery. They were dispossessed of property and starting from scratch with nothing but faith. Louis George Gregory was a brilliant African-American lawyer who dedicated his life to justice and establishing racial equality. By the end of his life, he had traveled more extensively and spoken more frequently on the subject of racial unity than any other Baha'i of that time. Upon his death in 1951, the head of the Baha'i faith elevated him to the rank of the first hand of the cause of God of his race. He is known as the standard bearer for racial unity. His grandmother and mother had been slaves on a plantation of George Washington Dargan in Darlington, South Carolina. By the 1800s, South Carolina was a major slave state, having more slaves than whites. Slavery was brutal. Female slaves were often sexually exploited by their owners to produce more slaves for profit. The nature of the relationship between Mr. Gregory's grandmother and G.W. Dargan is unknown. Regarding this, Mr. Gregory wrote, "My grandmother, wholly of African blood, was without ceremony his slave wife, and my mother his daughter. Their names were unknown to us." A very helpful, friendly historian looked through the Dargan family files, and he found a list of the names of all of the slaves, and I asked if he would send it to me. And I'll remember the Monday morning that it arrived in the mail. I was moved to tears when I saw the names of all of these men, women, and children, because I knew amongst these names were Louis Gregory's mother and grandmother. So the next question became, how do we find out which of these names belong to them?
I would suspect that this Mariah is the woman that you're looking for, because there's something special about her since they have this word keep after her name. I've never seen that on any other slave document. So I would assume that she could be the slave wife that you refer to. And we presume that this Mary down here, which is listed as a girl, is the Mary that is later listed with her in the household in the U.S. Census.
We enlisted the help of Dr. Roy Jones, a Baha'i brother in Charleston, South Carolina. And he did a very amazing search of public records. And with his research, he came up with some names. And I looked on the list, and they corresponded. And what we have put together is that the name of Louis Gregory's maternal grandmother, who was wholly of African descent, was Mariah. She was also known as Mary Bacote. And the name of Louis's mother is Mary Elizabeth Gregory. So I'm very pleased that we were able to identify his mother and grandmother. We owe them very much. We owe them so much because of the treasured son that they raised up, Louis Gregory, and his world-embracing service. Chancellor Dargan was a judge and state senator. He owned 119 slaves on 2 plantations. Despite his prominence and wealth, he made no provision for Mariah and Mary Elizabeth in his will, nor did he arrange their freedom upon his death in 1859. They remained enslaved until emancipation. They were, however, deeply grateful to Mrs. Louise Dargan for teaching them the kind of religion that involved a change of heart and putting ideals into action. About his white forebears, Mr. Gregory wrote,
"The Dargan family are outstanding and distinguished for their work in the field of religion and education. They accepted the end of slavery cheerfully and stimulated the progress and enlightenment of humanity. I did not choose them as my forebears, but in justice must acknowledge my obligation to them."
His mother and grandmother left the plantation after the war. His grandmother married a blacksmith who tried to improve his business by purchasing a mule.
He mentioned about his grandfather and how he had worked so hard to purchase a mule, and every time he got a mule, the mule was taken away from him.
His continued efforts to prosper drew the jealousy and rage of neighboring clansmen.
He did tell us that his grandfather was murdered by what we call clansmen today. And his mother, his grandmother, and he were the only ones who were in the house the night when the murder took place. And they were so frightened until they didn't even leave the house for 2 or 3 days, didn't open the door. Some of the neighbors, they assumed, crept in one night and moved the body and carried it away and buried it.
Louis's mother married Ebenezer George. They settled in Darlington, South Carolina, and eventually went to Charleston, South Carolina. Louis's father, Ebenezer George, died of tuberculosis when Louis was 5 years old, leaving him, his brother, and his mother in abject poverty until his mother remarried to George Gregory.
George Gregory became a real father to me, so that by his earnest wish, I took his name, becoming Louis George Gregory.
And this new Mr. Gregory was so kind and so loving to that family until little Louis went to him and asked him, could his name be Gregory? And he told him he didn't mind it. So Louis then went to his mother and grandmother and asked them, could he take his stepfather's name? And they consented. And from there on, he was Louis Gregory, which I thought he must have been a mighty kind man. Yes, sir.
His stepfather was born free. He provided economic advantages to the family that society would have otherwise denied them. He owned a home on Des Portes Court in Charleston. He sent Louis to Avery Institute, a private black high school run by the American Missionary Association. George Gregory enrolled Louis at Fisk University, an outstanding institution of higher education for black students in Nashville, Tennessee. He financed his first year there. Louis worked and obtained scholarships for the balance of his studies at Fisk. He was active in the Extempo Club. His highest aspiration, however, was to become a lawyer. He enrolled at Howard University in Washington, D.C., and graduated in 1902 and opened a law practice in that city. Later, he took a position with the United States Treasury Department. Louis Gregory was greatly influenced by W.E.B. Du Bois, a black leader who advocated complete social equality. Du Bois was one of the founders of the Niagara Movement. Although Louis was searching for social justice for his people, he wasn't necessarily searching for religion. At the Treasury Department, Mr. Gregory heard of the Baha'i faith from a Southern co-worker who thought its teachings would interest him. Late in 1907, Louis Gregory attended his first Baha'i meeting. The teacher was Louis Getzinger, one of the earliest believers in America, and among the first American pilgrims to meet Abdu'l-Baha. At this same meeting, Louis met Pauline Hannon, a white Southern woman who served as the hostess to both black and white guests, and together with her husband Joseph, became Louis's Baha'i teachers and friends for life.
The light they unfolded was so wonderful that for about a year we sat in dumb amazement, listening to their patient, loving talks, not knowing whether to advance or retreat, yet held by a supernal power. It comes to me that I have never taken occasion to thank you specifically for all your kindness and patience, which finally culminated in my acceptance of the great truths of the Baha'i revelation. It has given me an entirely new conception of Christianity and of all religion, and with it my whole nature seems changed for the better. It is a sane and practical religion, which meets all the varying needs of life, and I hope I shall ever regard it as a priceless possession.
He became a confirmed believer in June 1909 and wrote immediately to Abdu'l-Baha, as was the practice at that time. Abdu'l-Baha's reply not only expressed hopes for spiritual development, but for extraordinary expectations regarding Mr. Gregory's singular role in race relations.
Abdu'l-Baha wrote to me, "I hope that thou mayest become the means whereby the white and colored people shall close their eyes to racial differences and become the cause of the guidance of both races." During my early days of investigation, I rarely attended a meeting but went to the home of the Hannons, where my friends and I were always welcome. As soon as I became a believer and began to teach, however, my colored friends got on my back and began to press me with troublesome questions. If this were a new religion which stood for unity, why were its devotees divided? Why did they not meet all together in one place? Were the Baha'is not full of prejudice like other people?
It was clear that although the Baha'is had the spiritual guidance of the oneness of mankind, they were struggling with the application of this principle.
By far, the majority of my friends thought I had become mentally unbalanced. One of my old teachers, a professor of international law and a very affectionate friend, almost wept over my departure from orthodoxy, and with others warned me that I was blasting all my hopes of a career. The Washington Bee, a well-known colored newspaper, on one occasion gave me 2 columns of ridicule, which remained unanswered. Others, knowing my habit of engaging in controversy, said, "He must have religion if he does not answer that."
As soon as Louis Gregory became a Baha'i in 1909, he was faced with a very difficult situation. Louis Gregory had studied the Baha'i faith in settings that were integrated. He was in the Hannon's home, which he described as radiant and welcoming to all peoples. But when he became a Baha'i, he realized that the practice of segregation had not been questioned in the community. There were integrated events, but there were also many events that were racially segregated. And because of that, he was impelled to make change immediately so that he could bring his friends to events and they would not feel that the Baha'is were hypocritical.
Louis Gregory remained undaunted by the internal struggle of the Washington, D.C. Baha'is. He became an avid teacher in the black community, bringing the Baha'i message to the Bethel Literary and Historical Society and its 1,500 members who had elected him president. In March 1911, Louis Gregory made his pilgrimage to the Holy Land and Ramleh, Egypt, at the invitation of Abdu'l-Baha.
While there, the Master himself raised the issue of race during our first meeting when he asked, in general terms, "What of the conflict between white and colored races?" This question made me smile, for at once I felt my inquirer, although he had never in person visited America, yet knew more of conditions than I could ever know. I answered that there was much friction between the races, that those who accepted the Baha'i teachings had hopes of an amicable settlement of racial differences, while others were despondent.
The existence of racial prejudice among the Baha'is saddened Abdu'l-Baha. According to Louis Gregory, the expressive and beautiful face, nearly always joyful, changed. Suddenly, he revealed the sorrows of him who carries the burden of the world. He paced back and forth in silence, then seated himself, and finally retired, explaining he was very weary. Before Mr. Gregory's pilgrimage ended, Abdu'l-Baha made it clear that he intended that the races be completely and intimately united through intermarriage.
The colored people must attend all the unity meetings. There must be no distinctions. All are equal. If you have any influence to get the races to intermarry, it will be very valuable.
Abdu'l-Baha suggested that Louis Gregory and Louisa Matthew, a fellow pilgrim from England, become acquainted. He nurtured their friendship, which in time would bloom into a lifelong marriage. There were other souls attracted to the Baha'i teachings who were not inclined towards racial unity as an issue, let alone a calling. Such a soul was Agnes Parsons, born in 1861, just prior to the Emancipation Proclamation. The only child of General and Mrs. Royal, Mrs. Parsons was born into and lived in what at that time was considered a beautifully sheltered world. Until middle age, when she became a Baha'i, she had never known nor associated with anyone outside of her own immediate circle. Mrs. Agnes Parsons became a Baha'i in 1910, 1 year after Louis Gregory. She made her pilgrimage to the Holy Land that same year, at which time she had obtained a promise from Abdu'l-Baha that he would stay in her home if he came to America. He kept his promise and stayed in her new and elegant home in Washington, D.C. from April 20th to the 28th, 1912. He gave daily talks on numerous topics on that and 2 subsequent visits. Juliet Thompson recorded in her diary, "Mrs. Parsons' house has real distinction. It is Georgian in style, and it has a very long ballroom. At one end is an unusually high mantel, and the ceiling and paneled walls are delicately carved with garlands. Imagine the master striding with his free step, talking with his matchless ease to the people." Mr. and Mrs. Parsons maintained their summer home in Dublin, New Hampshire. In August of 1912, Mrs. Parsons turned over to Abdu'l-Baha for the exclusive use of himself and his entourage one of her places there, known as Dayspring. The master gave many talks there to influential leaders of thought. She was of the elite of Washington and introduced Abdu'l-Baha to politicians, artists, writers, professors, scientists, and other intellectual and cultural leaders of thought.
Agnes Parsons was born and bred in an extremely conservative, upper-class, conventional environment. She was conditioned by a society in which the races did not mix, except for her home and the homes of others where black domestics were customary. There was no thought, no concept of social equality. From that background, then, she was committed to the oneness of humankind, but with a filter, and that filter was her experience of separation of the races. It was something that was very evolutionary for her in the beginning. She didn't have a concept of social equality happening in her time. She saw it as something that maybe generations from now, maybe hundreds of years from now, would be possible in America, but not in her lifetime.
I think we have to understand is the racial thinking of whites at this point in time. And the racial thinking of many whites at this point in time was that blacks were legitimately situated on the margins of society, that was not necessarily a contradiction, that that's where black people belonged.
In 1912, Abdu'l-Baha came to America to bring the teachings of Baha'u'llah to the Western world. He said, "It is my purpose to set forth in America the fundamental principles of the revelation and teachings of Baha'u'llah. It will then become the duty of the Baha'is of this country to give these principles unfoldment and application in the minds, hearts, and lives of the people." During the Master's stay at the Parsons home, he not only met with white social and political elite, he made several addresses to important black organizations. Mrs. Parsons, unaccustomed to socializing with black people, did not accompany Abdu'l-Baha to any of these engagements. It was April 23rd in Washington, D.C. that Abdu'l-Baha first confronted, both in public addresses and in a social context, the issue of racial unity. Louis Gregory was at his side at every event. Before a full auditorium in the chapel of Howard University, addressing the faculty and students of Mr. Gregory's alma mater, the Master stated unequivocally that color is of no importance before God. He declared, "The accomplishment of unity between the colored and whites will be an assurance of the world's peace." The Howard University Journal published this famous address in its April 26, 1912 issue. After his speech, the Master challenged the practice of social segregation at a luncheon held in his honor at the home of Florence Breed Khan and Ali Kuli Khan, who was in charge of affairs at the Persian legation in the capital city. Prior to that fashionable event, Abdu'l-Baha had invited Louis Gregory to meet with him at the Khan's home. When the luncheon was announced, everyone followed the Master to the dining area, except Mr. Gregory. Then, in the presence of Washington's social and official notables, Abdu'l-Baha boldly asked, "Where is Mr. Gregory? Bring Mr. Gregory." Fortunately, Mr. Gregory had not yet left the house, but was waiting quietly to do so. Mr. Khan brought him into the dining room, and the Master himself rearranged the place settings to give him a place of honor.
I think it's very difficult for us now to appreciate how revolutionary Abdu'l-Baha's action in calling for Louis Gregory, who was not invited to the luncheon, in rearranging the table setting and placing Louis Gregory on his right in the seat of honor, how very revolutionary that was. It wasn't just a matter of social mixing or reordering the protocol of the event because everyone's place was dictated by protocol. It was breaking one of the major taboos of the period, which was that the races did not eat together. And then he proceeded to talk about the oneness of humankind.
Some of them probably felt that, well, you know, of course there's some conflict, but we can live with it. We can believe in the oneness of humanity and at the same time not want to sit down and break bread with black people, you see.
Agnes Parsons, sitting next to Abdu'l-Baha, really hadn't a clue about what was going on. She missed the point entirely. I think we would now say that she was in denial about what had happened. She was intent on her own interests at that point and asked a question about spiritual healing, completely missing the emphasis on the oneness of humankind that Abdu'l-Baha had just given in his talk and in his actions. And I think it was just that she simply could not take in what had happened. It was not conceivable for her. And when she wrote about the event in her diary, she mentioned nothing about what Abdu'l-Baha had done to emphasize the unity of the races.
That evening, Abdu'l-Baha addressed the Bethel Literary and Historical Association, which met at the Metropolitan African Methodist Episcopal Church on M Street Northwest. Presumably, this event had been arranged by Mr. Gregory, who served as its president. Mrs. Parsons chose not to attend. By April 30th, Abdu'l-Baha was in Chicago and addressed 3 audiences on the urgent need of this age to dispel the darkness of prejudice and to establish the light of unity, especially regarding race. To a racially mixed audience at the Hull House, founded by Jane Addams, he spoke of points of agreement and points of difference between the races in America, arguing we are one in language, intelligence, patriotism, citizenship, and religion. A single point of distinction exists, that of color. Shall this, he asked, the least of all distinctions, be allowed to separate you as races and individuals? To the large standing room only audience of the 4th Annual Convention of the NAACP, he spoke on racial equality. In May 1912, the NAACP honored Abdu'l-Baha as one of the Men of the Month, an honor usually reserved for African American men. W.E.B. Du Bois, editor of The Crisis, the NAACP journal, met Abdu'l-Baha on the occasion of his address to the convention and printed that talk as well as his Hull House address in the June 1912 issue of the journal. Within 1 week, Abdu'l-Baha had reached out to major black organizations, and through his sincerity, he had won their appreciation, thus establishing strong ties between the faith and black Americans. Once again, Abdu'l-Baha took a bold step to deepen the American believers' understanding of racial unity. He openly encouraged the marriage of Louis Gregory and Louisa Matthew. He had invited her to come to America and accompany him on his voyage on the Cedric. Louis Gregory and Louisa Matthew married in New York, September 27, 1912. In a tablet to Charles Mason Remy, the master wrote that interracial marriage would abolish differences and disputes between black and white, and would be a great service to the world of humanity. In 1912, interracial marriage was legal in Washington, D.C., but socially unacceptable. 25 states outlawed such marriages, and many people regarded them as a crime. In addition to segregating the races in public accommodations, Jim Crow laws prohibited interracial marriage. Nevertheless, the Gregorys were deeply committed to each other and remained married to the end of their lives.
There was a great fondness, and she was picked for him by Abdu'l-Baha, which made the relationship even stronger. But after some incidents, he did the traveling, and she stayed at home and kept the home fires burning. But he would go out where there was a telephone, not many black telephones in those days. He would go out where there was a telephone and talk with her at least every other day. They stayed in close communication. She knew where he was, how he was being received, and all of those things. Even the times when his wife tried to travel with him, she riding in one coach and he riding in the other, they didn't raise any noise about it. It was just two human beings trying to carry the message of God.
They lived in the house across the street from the Rogers cottage, and we had bus transportation years ago. It made the rounds of Elliott to Portsmouth every hour. So Louise would take the bus into the grocery store, and he was always there when the bus came, and to help her in the house with the groceries. To me, it's like seeing young people hand-holding. You know? It's when they were older and close, the closeness of being kind to each other.
The fact that Abdu'l-Baha himself advocated interracial marriage did not make it easy for some Baha'is to accept. Agnes Parsons, who was regarded as the mother of the Washington, D.C. Baha'i community, was very troubled about interracial marriage. She wrote to Alfred Lunt, a Baha'i lawyer of Boston, about his legal perspective, presumably to gain support for her position. Alfred Lunt probably disappointed her with his reply. He wrote, "Had the manifestations themselves adopted a policy of compromise, they might have preserved thereby their lives and possessions. Had the people of the world not been capable today of living according to the law of oneness, it would not have been decreed." As the Baha'is continued to struggle to rise to the standards of interracial fellowship set forth in the teachings of their faith, Louis Gregory arose to bring the healing message of the oneness of mankind to his fellow countrymen across America. According to Harlan Ober, it is probable that no individual teacher in the faith has traveled more extensively throughout the United States than Mr. Gregory, living in utmost simplicity, sacrificing at every turn. He spoke in schools, colleges, churches, forums, conferences, and with individuals. He met high and low, rich and poor, educated and uneducated, and gave them the cup of the water of life. In 1916, the first of the Master's Tablets of the Divine Plan arrived in the United States. Abdu'l-Baha particularly called for teachers to arise to establish the faith in the southern states. Mr. Gregory arose immediately to answer the call. By 1917, he and Louisa sold their home to provide the funds for Louis's teaching tours. He reached audiences of thousands of both races. with the message of Baha'u'llah. A frequent speaker at black colleges and secondary schools, Mr. Gregory was twice invited by Booker T. Washington to speak at the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. His service to the cause is all the more stunning when we appreciate the conditions under which he, as a black man, had to travel. Jim Crow trains and buses, segregated facilities and accommodations were daily reminders to people of color that they were second-class citizens. For his entire life, segregation was the law of much of the land, and only began to change after his death in 1951. Despite a lifetime of being relegated to second-class status as a person of color, Mr. Gregory transcended his environment, always turning his heart to God, enduring every hardship with a radiant spirit, and remained constant in his service of uniting all peoples.
I only heard stories about the service on Jim Crow cars where you couldn't get any food at all. If you didn't take a lunch, you had to depend on what was offered by the sellers at train stops. And I know he experienced the humiliation of when he left Ohio, having the curtain drawn if he was in the dining room, because they would always draw a curtain to separate any blacks in the dining room from the whites. And I know that if he had to encounter a refreshment, he wanted to refresh himself, he ought to always look for a station that would have four-colored, because you didn't dare go to the white station to refresh yourself, or even to drink water, because they had colored fountains and white fountains. And the maintenance of the facilities for colored was always dreadful.
I can't even begin to formulate words that express the depth of appreciation and gratitude that I feel towards Mr. Gregory for having done that at great personal cost to himself. The second decade of the 20th century witnessed a rise in racial hostility and violence across the nation. Abdu'l-Baha had warned that racial violence would erupt unless prejudices are entirely removed from the people of the world. Nay, rather, discord and bloodshed will be increased day by day, and the foundation of the prosperity of the world of man will be destroyed. His predictions were accurate. Racial violence increased during and after World War I as large numbers of black soldiers returned from military service in Europe. They had fought for democracy abroad. Now they were prepared to assume full rights of citizenship at home. Competition for jobs increased as soldiers of all colors returned from the war. The KKK grew in membership and spread from south to north and west. It sponsored parades across the country, including the nation's capital. As Black Americans pursued education and jobs, lynching became more frequent. At one point, it was noted that news of lynchings occurred in the newspaper once every 6 days.
The practice of lynching that was prevalent in the United States in those years varied from place to place and from mob to mob. It included hangings, mutilations, castrations, torture. It involved men of all ages, boys, elderly men. It was often premeditated because it could even be announced ahead of time. It wasn't just the result of mob action without any forethought. And these events had something of the quality of a circus. They were spectator events, and people came and brought their children to these horrific bloodlettings. A book called Without Sanctuary has recently been published that documents in photographs these terrible events. It's really difficult for us now to appreciate how prevalent this was, how ugly it was as a facet of American life.
The NAACP organized protests, marches, and newspaper ad campaigns against lynching. In 1919 alone, there were 84 lynchings as shown in a map published in the Crisis NAACP Journal. Violence erupted in more than 25 major cities in the summer of 1919, including Washington, D.C. and Chicago. This summer was named the Red Summer for the fires that raged and the blood that was spilled in urban centers. In Washington, D.C., white servicemen attacked blacks. White gangs attempted to burn the black district, and its residents rose to defend themselves and their property. The New York Times headlines underscore the bloodshed that Abdu'l-Baha had predicted a decade earlier. The black newspaper in Washington, the Washington Bee, expressed the outrage at the ingratitude of a nation that used black soldiers to fight for democracy abroad, but failed to provide it for them at home. Chicago experienced one of the worst race riots of the Red Summer. White gangs chased black victims, beating them to death. Homes were bombed and burned, killing their residents. Entire neighborhoods were under siege for more than a week. Whites would drive through neighborhoods shooting into homes. Blacks had to stay in their houses and could not go out for food and supplies.
Abdu'l-Baha sent Zia Baghdadi to the United States to complete his medical training. He arrived in the United States in 1909, I believe. And almost immediately, because he was well-deepened and a warm and sympathetic person, he began forming ties with all sorts of people. He reached across the racial barriers that separated people at the time and made friendships with Louis Gregory and others of color. So he played from the very beginning, he played a role as a harmonizer of the races. In 1919, he also played a very heroic role in taking food to people who were prevented by the race riots that were going on at the time in Chicago from going out and getting provisions. And he was respected by both blacks and whites for his courage and his forthrightness.
When I was in America, I told the white and colored people that it was incumbent upon them to be united, or else there would be the shedding of blood. But indeed, there is a greater danger than only the shedding of blood. It is the destruction of America. The bombing of 2 or 3 houses is of no importance, but the importance lies in what is coming, which is the destruction of America. Now is the time for Americans to take up this matter and unite both the white and the colored races. Otherwise, hasten ye towards destruction. Hasten ye towards destruction. During that eventful summer, the executive board of the Baha'i Temple Unity consulted on what responsibility they had to address the state of race relations in America. They invited Louis Gregory, Joseph Hannen, Dr. Baghdadi, and other concerned believers to confer about ways to promote the principle of the oneness of mankind in the wake of the race riots. While the executive board consulted about what to do, the master himself took matters into his own hands and created the first public Baha'i initiative on race in America, and probably the world. Louis Gregory described Abdu'l-Baha's initiative.
He set in motion a plan that was to bring the races together, attract the attention of the country, enlist the aid of famous and influential people, and have a far-reaching effect upon the destiny of the nation itself.
His plan consisted of a series of large, well-publicized, interracial meetings proclaiming the oneness of mankind and promoting racial unity between black and white Americans. In a period when segregation was the law of much of the land, and when few organizations, civic or religious, stood for equality, such conventions were unprecedented. What was especially surprising was his appointing Agnes Parsons as the person responsible for organizing the first Race Amity Convention, which was to be held in the nation's capital. Abdu'l-Baha did not appoint Mrs. Parsons to organize the first Race Amity Convention because of her experience with racial issues. He chose her because he saw in her a willingness to obey the center of the covenant. Thus, she became an obedient, though reluctant, servant of racial unity. During her second pilgrimage to the Baha'i holy places in the winter and spring of 1920, Abdu'l-Baha gave her a remarkable instruction, a command. I want you to arrange a convention for unity of the colored and white races. Of course, you must have people to help you. This instruction was not sought by Mrs. Parsons. It was a complete surprise. The blessings that come to one are greater than those one seeks, Abdu'l-Baha said.
I thought I would go through the floor because I did not feel I could do it. I waited for more instructions and he said nothing more. Well, then a very extraordinary thing happened. I felt suddenly the power of his creative words. I was really getting the confidence that of course was necessary. And Abdu'l-Baha said absolutely nothing more to me. I was hoping every day that I would have some more instructions, but he did not give it to me.
Upon her return to the United States, Mrs. Parsons, never having organized a major event and unsure of how to proceed, always said,
I will be able to do it. I must, for it is the will of Abdu'l-Baha. I will. I must. My friends are so heedless, so indifferent.
She consulted Louise Boyle, a Baha'i friend.
Louise set up a meeting with ex-Senator Clapp of Nebraska, who had always been a great friend to the colored people. We had a talk for about 2 hours in Mrs. Boyle's apartment, and he was undoubtedly the instrument who Abdu'l-Baha used to give me the plan.
The plan, the senator suggested, was to get a group of women to help organize the convention. The program should avoid political extremism and polarization or alienating conservatives. He urged that protests be avoided and a positive note struck. Indeed, this became Mrs. Parsons' byword.
Do not make a protest about anything. Lift the whole matter up into the spiritual realm and work for the creation of sentiment.
She turned to Louis Gregory for advice, who had by this time distinguished himself in the field of racial unity. He was not hesitant to be bold, but he was tired of empty rhetoric. He wrote her,
Nothing short of a change of heart will do. Unless the speakers are able to make the power of love felt, the occasion will lose its chief value.
He saw the purely social and economic interracial conferences as unproductive because a spiritual remedy was lacking.
If the Washington Interracial Congress is along these conventional lines, I fear it will, like the others, be fruitless. But if it be aflame with the fire of the divine love, the hearts will be powerfully influenced, and the effect will be great in all the years to come.
He recommended a fairly direct Baha'i program and stressed the urgency to hold this convention very soon.
The situation seems to be getting more critical day by day. This despite the fact that many earnest and sincere souls of both races are striving for harmony and understanding.
A committee of women, black and white, was formed to help Mrs. Parsons. Gabrielle Pelham, Louise Boyle, Miriam Haney, Martha Root, and Coralie Cook. They scheduled the convention for May 19th through the 21st, 1921, at the First Congregational Church in Washington, a church historically known for its opposition to racial prejudice and which had close ties with Howard University. Both institutions were founded by General Oliver Otis Howard, a Union Army officer and abolitionist. Mr. Gregory wrote,
19 ladies from the social life of the city gave the prestige of their names as fashionable patrons. It was to be the first convention of amity between the white and colored races in America, and so far as we know, the world.
During the months that Agnes Parsons spent organizing this first convention, the Master sent her words of encouragement. Less than a month before the event, he wrote to her that she was well known in the kingdom of God, that the convention would ease America of great racial tensions, and finally, he wished her success in implementing the first historic convention. Mr. Gregory reported,
the spirit of reconciliation seemed to sweep the city. Howard University provided stirring music by its glee club and chorus. The fruitage of seed sowed by the Master 9 years earlier was apparent.
Frederick Douglass's grandson, Joseph, a concert violinist, performed. A stellar cast of prominent speakers graced the platform, black and white, guests and Baha'is. Congress was represented. It was reliably stated that President Warren Harding, upon reading the press reports which were so friendly and widespread, said, "Thank God for that convention." 19,000 programs were distributed to schools, hotels, churches, stores, and other public places. Excellent press coverage before and after the first convention was orchestrated by Martha Root. Boldly stated, the purpose of the convention was on the front page of the program. The great work we have to do, and for which this convention is called, is the establishment of amity between the white and colored people of our land. When we have put our own house in order, then we may be trusted to carry the message of universal peace to all mankind.
In a letter from Abdu'l-Baha and read by Mumford Mills, the Master stated the significance of this convention. Never since the beginning of time has one more important been held. It will be the cause of the enlightenment of America. It will, if wisely managed and continued, check the deadly struggle between these races, which otherwise will inevitably break out.
The convention was a smashing success. From May 19th through the 21st, 1921, audiences of many races and to a full capacity of 2,000 attended each session. Baha'is chaired every session. Prayers of Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Baha were read. The results were transforming. Harry Randall, a white Baha'i who served as chairman for the first session of the convention, reported,
as the sessions progressed, the harmonies of amity and fellowship became apparent in all hearts. At the end of the second evening, one splendid colored man, sitting just behind me, exclaimed that this surely is the advent of the new day of racial understanding, and sighed, "I hardly know where I am, so happy am I." and I turned to him and said, "I know where you are. You are in heaven because you are in race unity."
I sent a cable to the master immediately after the convention ended. Convention successful, meetings crowded, hearts comforted. To which Abdu'l-Baha replied at once by cable, and it said, "The white-colored convention produced happiness. Hoping will establish in all America."
In several tablets to Mrs. Parsons and to other believers, Abdu'l-Baha showered her with his praise for her pioneering service. "O thou dear, true daughter, your convention is like the Mother Convention, which shall give birth to many others. Thou wert the founder of this convention. Therefore the confirmation of the kingdom of Abha shall constantly reach any person who strives after the conciliation of the colored and the white. Thank God that thou art the first person who established a race convention." She had won the admiration and praise of Abdu'l-Baha, who had in turn richly blessed her pioneering service in the field of race unity. Louis Gregory felt that Abdu'l-Baha had made a perfect choice in asking Mrs. Parsons to organize the first convention.
As Abdu'l-Baha himself instructed for the first Racial Amity Conference, he wisely, I think, put that matter in the hands of Mrs. Parsons, a white Baha'i of wealth and social prominence. To have a colored man always clamoring for colored people's rights savors somewhat of politics and agitation, rather than of a cause whose dynamics is spirituality. It is far better for a white person to do this in the cause, and for the colored to lend their consultation and support. We must all do what we can to aid this work.
Louis Gregory could see the wisdom of picking a powerful white socialite. And it was important that this person be put in this position as a change agent to show the possibility of the Baha'i faith, you see, and the potential of the Baha'i faith, the power of the Baha'i faith, to transform someone who was obviously not a believer in social equality.
Her willingness to serve and her dedication to the faith were such that she rose above the crippling experiences of her culture and background.
By choosing Agnes Parsons, Abdu'l-Baha sent a message that this issue was for everybody.
She adored Abdu'l-Baha, and she would do whatever he asked her to do. She stepped way outside of her comfort zone. And look what she gave us. She gave us a model of how to overcome that stuff and how to move forward with confidence that Abdu'l-Baha would be right there, making sure we would land on our feet. The Master wanted Race Amity Conventions to be held across the country. Baha'is arose and held Race Amity Conventions in the northern, Midwest, and western states. The South was still under Jim Crow laws, so interracial large public conferences were against the law. Abdu'l-Baha had placed a priority on enlisting the support of prominent people. Baha'is went to great lengths to get the most recognized people who could address racial issues with credibility and eloquence. Over the next 2 decades, Race Amity Conventions attracted the following famous guest speakers. Alain Locke, professor of philosophy at Howard University. W.E.B. Du Bois, writer and one of the founders of the Niagara Movement and the NAACP. Jane Addams, founder of Hull House, social worker who met Abdu'l-Baha. Franz Boas, professor of anthropology at Columbia University. Professor Boas, incidentally, presented the scientific evidence of the oneness of all races. Charles Dawes, former Vice President of the United States and Nobel Peace Prize winner. Senator Samuel Shortridge of California. A. Philip Randolph, founder of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and James Weldon Johnson, writer in the Harlem Renaissance and secretary of the NAACP. As Louis Gregory advised, nothing short of a change of heart will do. Many of the Race Amity conventions offered the Baha'i spiritual perspective directly. Others were more indirect in their approach. Sacred scripture from many religions served to broaden the spiritual basis of Race Amity work. Use of the arts and music were powerful. Spirituals and melodies of the Black people moved the hearts, enhanced the atmosphere, and inspired souls to move forward with interracial fellowship. Why did Abdu'l-Baha place the responsibility and the opportunity of carrying out the first Race Amity Convention in the hands of a white, privileged American? Even though Mrs. Parsons had little awareness of her greater social calling and duty, she was chosen because of her social connections and status and her devotion to Abdu'l-Baha. The wisdom of the Master is clear. Mrs. Parsons arose in obedience to Abdu'l-Baha's command and won a spiritual place in his heart and in our history. Louis Gregory devoted his entire life to furthering racial unity and was elevated to the rank of Hand of the Cause of God, a station reserved by Baha'u'llah, prophet of the Baha'i faith, for his most trusted and selfless servants. Race Amity Conferences, however, were never intended to replace the fundamental change that must occur within the human heart. Shoghi Effendi, the grandson of Abdu'l-Baha and head of the Baha'i faith after Abdu'l-Baha's passing, said, "Baha'is of all races must exercise their freedom from prejudice in their close and intimate social intercourse, in their homes, in their hours of relaxation and leisure, in the daily contact of business transactions, and in the association of their children." In 1936, Shoghi Effendi urged the Baha'is to continue placing Race Amity Conferences on the American agenda. Concerning them, he believed they constituted a vital and inseparable part of the teaching campaign being carried on by the American believers. And he said, "It is the duty of every loyal Baha'i to do all that he can possibly do to promote this phase of Baha'i activity, without which no campaign of teaching can bear lasting results." In 1987, the Universal House of Justice, the international governing body of the Baha'i faith, urged us to consider reviving Race Amity conventions.
It was important back in 1921. It's even more important now. So when the Universal House of Justice talks about revisiting that, they're talking about revisit this model, think through these basic principles that animated the model, and then bring it up to the present. The major problems that we were facing then, believe it or not, we are seeing them magnified today.
And recently we've had the South Carolina flag issue, Amadou Diallo, Rodney King, James Byrd, the hate groups that are targeting young people. We have some dire issues that are on an urgent agenda, an urgent social agenda for us to address race issues in our country.
The eradication of prejudice in American society is a task for all of us. It's a task that, in particular, white people need to own. Agnes Parsons, who was so unsuited, temperamentally unsuited, not interested, but in obedience to Abdu'l-Baha, played a tremendous role, a dramatic role, in furthering the racial amity work, is an example to all of us. If she could do it, we can do it. And I think that Zia Baghdadi is another example, because here is someone who could say, well, it wasn't my problem. I'm from another part of the world, and this is a problem of the American people that I don't need to own. But instead, he played a leadership role in harmonizing the races.
As I think about it, I'm not an organizer of conferences, but when the Guardian asked me to, as a loyal believer, to make a contribution towards reviving Race Amity Conferences, I'm going to do what I can. I don't see how I can't. It's a mandate. The Southern Baha'is were handicapped. Laws were against interracial gatherings. We could not participate in Race Amity Conferences during those decades. But friends, there's nothing to stop us now.
Neither Mrs. Parsons nor Mr. Gregory could ever have dreamed of the facilities and the encouragement which exists today. They had to just go slowly and find whatever they could, but they went. And today, we who have so much at our disposal are just sitting back, and I don't know what we're waiting for, but we should be galvanized into action, because now is the time. As the saying goes, if not now, when?
Friends, Race Amity Conferences are as relevant today as they were in the early part of the 20th century, as the Universal House of Justice has reminded us. Abdu'l-Baha promises confirmation for anyone who arises to reconcile the races in America. And if you join this service from a position of great experience about racial issues, as was the case with Mr. Gregory, or if you come with almost no experience, as was initially the case with Agnes Parsons, there's a special place for everyone in this work. We hope you'll give prayerful consideration to conducting Race Amity Conferences in your area as a service to our country. As you reflect how Mr. Gregory and Mrs. Parsons attracted blessings and confirmations for their work in this field, let us each consider arising and following in their footsteps.
Joining hand in hand all across this mighty land, united in spirit and bringing a balm to a sin-sick world. We may have to struggle and we may have to cry, but we are assisted by the concourse on the high. mighty land, united in spirit and bringing a balm to a sin-sick world. We may have to struggle and we may have to cry, but we are assisted by the concourse on